The National Association of Scholars has been blessed with some extraordinary staff members, and I now have the pleasure to introduce one of them, Rachelle Peterson. There's some difficulty to this in that Rachelle is almost too good to be believed. She grew up on an Indian reservation. She's not a Native American, but an Indian reservation in Arizona, and attended the King's College, where she graduated valedictorian in 2013. She was at the time interning at the Manhattan Institute, where my wife, Jody, was also working. And Jody, who has an eye for such things, spotted her as a, as they would say in the business world, an underutilized resource. Brought Rachelle with her to a short stint at the Institute for American Values, where they did some work opposing new casinos in New York. And then Jody convinced me, you've got to meet this woman and bring her to the National Association of Scholars. I was broke, I couldn't do it, but I hired her as an intern anyway. That was in the summer of 2013. Soon after that, I persuaded the Roop Foundation to fund our work on sustainability. Now, this calls for kind of breaking the narrative. From 2008 to 2013, Ashley Thorne and I churned out some 200 articles about the sustainability movement. We published them wherever we could, many of them on our website. I was convinced as of 2008 that this movement was the coming thing in higher education. This was the ideology that was going to take middle-class students by storm, and that it represented a really dire threat to intellectual freedom. I couldn't even convince my board very much, let alone anybody else, but Ashley and I kept at it. And eventually I found Arthur Roop, who said, okay, I'll give it a try. So suddenly we had about $100,000 on hand, and I had Rachelle. I wasn't quite sure what I had with Rachelle, but I said, okay, you're in charge of finding out what's really at the bottom of the sustainability movement. And over the course of about 9 months or so, she pretty much single-handedly wrote our first report, Sustainability, Higher Education's New Fundamentalism. Well, I had a hand in writing that too, but it's mainly Rachelle's work. This is a recent college graduate with just a bachelor's degree, and she did astonishing work on this. When she finished the draft, we sent it out to more than a dozen experts in the field. Very few of them could find any mistakes in it, although we did get some really helpful advice about additional topics. So we took another 4 or 5 months and reworked it, added some chapters, and greatly improved it. That was released in March of this year, March of 2015. We had a lot of interviews and press activity for the rest of March. And Rachelle took a deep breath, and I said, okay, you now have till September to do our next report, which is going to be on divestment, since the last chapter of sustainability promised that the divestment movement was the leverage point of this movement, where it really would take its case publicly and in an important way. So what you have before you now is Inside Divestment, which is entirely Rachelle's work, executed basically in 3 months of very intense effort. She works with dispatch and with diligence, but she also works very long hours, and her poor suffering husband, I'm sure, gets to hear about Inside Divestment night and day. The divestment movement, as depicted here, is of course filtered through the lens of one person's sensibility. So you need to know something about that sensibility. I cannot for the life of me get Rachelle to take a political position on anything. She is devoted to facts. She is someone who believes, I think sometimes incorrectly, that the facts speak for themselves, and she has taken her case in this long document to be as scrupulously fair as she possibly could be. Now, that ethic has something to do with why she was as successful at this as she was, because Rachelle has, for the last 2 years, showed up at every sustainability and divestment event that she could get near. A lot of those have been in New York, so she became a familiar face to divestment activists, none of whom ever seemed to think that there was anything amiss in this young woman showing up, asking questions and writing things down. She wouldn't misrepresent herself for a bag of gold. If they'd asked her who you're working for and what are you doing, she would have said, but nobody did. So on and on she went, going deeper and deeper. Inside Divestment is inside divestment. She was pretty much embedded in this movement, and she knows as much about it as anybody who's part of it. Now, that all came to an end when she appeared on, I think it was a Wall Street Journal TV program, and just again plainly said what she was about, and words suddenly went out within the whole divestment movement. Watch out for this dangerous person. People whom she'd been speaking to for months on the telephone wouldn't take her calls or hung up on her or said rude things to her. And Rachelle was hurt by this. She just didn't understand that the world works in a manner where if people have doubts about your political utility, they stomp on you. But she's recovered from that, I think. She and I continue to argue about how important is it that we draw larger political lessons from this. I don't think the press pays any attention to us unless we draw the connection between the divestment movement and what President Obama is doing in Paris. I don't think that any of this matters unless we get people to see that the divestment movement has something to do with plutocrats like Al Gore making tens of millions of dollars off green investments, that when you depress the price of gas and oil and coal, you artificially raise the price of alternative energy, and that has something to do with this movement. I don't want to call into question the sincerity or good faith of a lot of the people who support this movement, who think that they're saving the world from imminent incineration or something worse. But despite that goodwill, this movement really does work to the advantage of some people and to the disadvantage of others, and that's worth pointing out. You won't get Rachelle to say that. Well, maybe you will. I'm trying hard. In any case, basically in a little over a year, Rachelle has produced something like 600 pages of published work on this movement, as well as many articles and endless interviews. I think she is someone to keep your eye on, and if you get nothing else out of this event today, you should register an important new player in the world of public intellectuals. With that, I'd like to introduce Rachelle.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you all for being here. As the author of Inside Divestment, it is my responsibility to take you inside this report. So we're going to go inside Divestment for a few minutes. And I hope you will take home both of these documents, 16-page summary of the report and the full 300-page report. Do crack those open and look at them. There's a wealth of data and information in here. And I think it will be useful to you. Thank you all for being here. Special welcome to Jamie and Lindsay from 350.org. Thanks for being here. So let's go inside Divestment for a few minutes. There's a lot in this report, but there are three main takeaways that I'm going to give you today. The first is the capture of the cultural imagination of a generation of students. The second is the politicization of higher education, a theme that several speakers have touched on. I'm going to talk about it in more detail, what that looks like with divestment. And the third is calling the movement's bluff. I'm going to lay out some ideas of what we can be doing as we look at higher education and the ideals of what it can be. So first, the fossil fuel divestment movement has succeeded in capturing the imaginations of a significant minority of American college students. And that's dangerous because of what the movement's version of the American dream entails. Let me give you some numbers that speak to this capturing of the imaginations of these students. There are 30 American colleges and universities that have announced divestments from fossil fuels, either all fossil fuels or in some cases just coal and tar sands companies. In some cases, all investments. In others, it's more limited only to direct investments. But this is some type of divestment decision, some type of decision that these are the values that the university is going to publicly proclaim. These institutions include some familiar names, including Stanford, Georgetown, here in New York City, the New School, and there are another 22 colleges and universities in other parts of the world. I think that number is right. I believe there were just 8 new ones announced today in the UK. And those in the UK include Oxford. There are 72% of Harvard undergraduates who have voted in favor of fossil fuel divestment when this question came up in front of them. There are more than 1,000 divestment campaigns. This is up from fewer than a dozen as of 2011. By our count, there are 4,000 American college professors who have publicly stated their support for fossil fuel divestment, either by voting on this in the faculty senate or signing petitions. In the back of this report, you'll find an appendix that gives more detail on that. Some of these professors have taught classes on fossil fuel divestment and given college credit to students who work on divestment campaigns. So this is college credit for a political campaign. One last number, this spring there were 11 sit-ins on college campuses as part of what the activists are calling divestment spring. These included places such as Harvard and Yale and Swarthmore College, which had the hallway outside the finance office occupied for 32 days straight, with a stream of 200 people rotating in and out, including professors who brought their classes to come have class in the hallway outside the finance office with the sit-in. And when I interview students who are active in the fossil fuel divestment campaign, they talk about climate change and the dangers associated with that, but they also talk about the meaning that this campaign gives to them. Here are some of those reasons. Global warming, these students say, is the issue of their generation, and fossil fuel divestment is anything that they can do to make a difference. There's also some FOMO, fear of missing out. They're worried about being on the wrong side of history. One of the main arguments that proponents of divestment have made is that history is an active force and there are right and wrong sides, and being for divestment means being on the right side of history, and being against divestment means you are going to be left on the wrong side. They do this by a number of analogies. This is a movement that is heavy on analogies, not always so heavy on proving that those analogies are the right ones. But here are a couple of the analogies. One is the analogy to the Arab Spring. I referred a moment ago to divestment spring this past March and April. And this is an analogy that the push for divestment is akin to the push for democracy in the Middle East, because trustees who do not favor divestment are oligarchs, akin to dictators who would deprive decision-making powers from others who would like them. Another analogy is to slavery. This argument is that the nation was built on an unjust form of energy in the form of human slavery, and that today the economy is now built on another unjust form of energy, fossil fuels. That analogy is less clear to me. The injustice seems to be very, very different. The injustice to the slaves versus injustice to the fossil fuels. Or I don't think anyone is trying to claim that fossil fuels are suffering injustice. It's a little bit different. And in light of analogies like that, joining a divestment campaign maybe doesn't sound like such a hard decision for college students. Who really wants your college dorm mates to think of you as akin to John C. Calhoun? But one reason that a lot of college students give for joining this campaign is that they want to do hard things. They want to do something that's difficult, that challenges them, and that gives them a sense of the real world outside of college. And the unfortunate truth is that college is not a hard place right now for a lot of students. College is not rigorous. The core curriculum has disintegrated into distribution requirements or into nothing at all. Academic standards have declined, and for a lot of students, that leaves a fair amount of time that can be devoted to activism, and it also leaves a kind of longing for something difficult. If college is not hard anymore, you have to find something else to challenge yourself, and the fossil fuel divestment movement fills that need for a number of them. These are some of the ways that the imaginations of these students have been captured. The capturing can also be done in a more militant manner. And we describe some of these ways in the report, and I do hope you'll take a look at it. The fossil fuel divestment movement has no time for the niceties of academic freedom and free speech. It bullies dissenters. It ostracizes those who disagree. When I spoke to students who were not part of the divestment campaign and asked them what they thought about divestment, they were usually very hesitant to speak. And when they did speak, they often did not want their names used. And as the conversation continued and the reasons came out, usually the case was that they didn't think divestment was a good idea. They didn't think it would be effective, even self-identified students who considered themselves environmentalists who would oppose divestment and they thought it was ineffective. They felt like it was not okay to say that on college campus. It was not appropriate to be against divestment, and so they would tacitly support it even though they didn't really think it was a good idea. They would vote for it when it came up on the student referendum, or they would just decline to vote at all, and when the protest was happening on campus, they didn't like that it was happening, but they would just let it go because the consequences of publicly opposing the movement were disastrous to them. The most poignant example of this happened at Swarthmore College 2.5 years ago when a group of students affiliated with Swarthmore Mountain Justice and some of their other allies on campus hijacked a board meeting. The board had agreed for the first time in its history to a public meeting in which any students could attend, professors could attend. They would consider the question of fossil fuel divestment. They would share a panel with the students who were in favor of divestment. The trustees of the board of managers would lay out their concerns about divestment. The activists would have their chance to make the case. And then there would be a public question and answer time where others who were concerned could raise their questions. Before even 2 minutes of this meeting had elapsed, 200 students flooded this room with placards that read, "Check your ignorance," and "This is social responsibility." Went on a tirade for the next hour and a half, and when 2 students in the audience who opposed divestment and also opposed the takeover of the meeting dared to stand up and simply ask if the meeting could return to its stated agenda, the students at the front of the room clapped them down and prevented them from speaking, and then went to them and said, "You are free to leave." This is not an example of responsible social advocacy. The fossil fuel divestment movement is premised on a smear campaign. That is what divestment is. It does not bankrupt the fossil fuel industry. The supporters of divestment acknowledge that. The students that I've spoken to acknowledge that. The goal is to stigmatize an industry and anyone affiliated with them. And anyone who dares to oppose divestment gets wrapped in with that as well, and they get smeared too. This is a dangerous vision of what American society should be, that anyone you disagree with should be smeared and attacked, that common ground for discussion and discourse should be eroded in the name of polarizing a question and making it into a simple yes or no, with us or against us, good and bad. This is not the kind of things that college students should be training in, and the way that they should be thinking that American society and American self-government operates in the future. My second point is the fossil fuel divestment movement is turning institutions of higher learning, along with their professors and students, into tools of political advocacy. Often the advocates of divestment say, well, the university is already politicized. It's in the hands of the fossil fuel industry. It's in the hands of the people we disagree with. And therefore, we're not politicizing it. We're taking it back. We're depoliticizing it and rescuing it from the grasps of these people that we disagree with. Usually, that argument is made simply as an assertion, without taking the trouble to prove that the university is in the grasp of this evil, asserted to be evil group of people. And so the fossil fuel divestment movement turns the university endowment into a billboard for virtue signaling. It turns trustees and donors into political operatives rather than patrons and protectors of a great tradition of knowledge and of learning that they can pass on to the next generation. It turns higher education into a tool for a much larger political goal. I spoke earlier about 4,000 professors who have supported divestment in some way. Some of them are teaching classes on divestment, are teaching their students that this political advocacy is the proper thing for a college to be doing, is the proper thing for a college student to engage in. And students are being graded on their participation in these campaigns. For an example of how politicized this movement is, I want to introduce you to a term that we use in our report. That term is dinos. These are divestments in name only. If you were looking for evidence that divestment is an empty political stunt, look no further than our list of dinos. We have 4 universities that have made some kind of divestment announcement and have done absolutely nothing. They have not divested anything. No change in the endowment at all. We have another 4 runner-up dinos that divested next to nothing. For instance, Stanford University, which said it had a very small fraction of its endowment directly invested in coal. That was the only part affected. Georgetown said it had an insubstantial portion of its endowment directly invested in coal. Some of our other dinos include Syracuse University, which said it would divest from its direct investments in fossil fuel companies. Later came out no such investments exist. And the Tyrannosaurus Rex of these dinos is Oxford University, which has become the poster child for much of the divestment movement as kind of the go-to example of a prominent place that has made this decision. Oxford announced earlier this year that it would sell off its direct investments in fossil fuel companies. I had an interview with the finance officer at Oxford who confirmed to me Oxford has no investments in fossil fuel companies. It did not have any before it made the divestment decision. Nothing was affected by this. So these are decisions that, by their own admission, have no weight whatsoever, even if the argument is advanced that divestment could affect the funding of the fossil fuel industry. If that's the case, these are not really the go-to examples to use because no money has been moved. And yet, those are the examples that are used by advocates of the movement of prominent institutions that have made the decision to divest. We looked closely at the divestment decisions of each of the American colleges and universities that has made a divestment decision as of September 1st. That was our cutoff for our research, and only 34% of the divested colleges and universities have fully divested from fossil fuels. So the fact that universities can be celebrated for doing nothing more than getting a headline and injecting politics into the boardroom is another sign that this is not an apolitical campaign. And that is dangerous because if this movement succeeds in its aims, it exterminates the political neutrality of higher education. It hijacks the idea of free speech and of academic freedom, and it turns these terms into a cover for political activism. At the board meeting at Swarthmore that I mentioned a few minutes ago, where the students hijacked this meeting, took over the microphones. At that meeting, the president of the college, Rebecca Chop, declined to intervene, as did the dean of students, as did all of the board members, all of the other university staff present. Afterwards, President Chop explained why she let the students take over the board meeting and did nothing to intervene. Her explanation was that the students had the academic freedom to say what they wanted to say. So even the term academic freedom is used as a wedge, is used as a way to justify the taking away of somebody else's freedom to speak in the predetermined, pre-arranged, pre-agreed upon method of that conversation. The final point that I'll leave you with is the fossil fuel divestment movement has grown very fast. It has convinced large numbers of students to join, but this movement derives much of its momentum from projecting an oversized image of itself. Much of the movement is premised on a bluff, and there is opportunity to reclaim higher education from this political fad. And so for those of us who are concerned about this movement, we should call bluff. I mentioned the dinos already, these decisions to divest without actually divesting. Earlier, I mentioned that the divestment movement has succeeded in capturing the imaginations of a significant minority of college students. It's important to emphasize this is a minority. It is not the majority, as much as the movement does try to project itself as the consensus opinion of an entire generation of students. Again, when I interview students on college campuses and ask them what they think, in most cases, the divestment campaigns are being run by a very loud but very small group of activists on campus, and the rest of the students feel pressured to keep quiet. Those students do not have their voice taken away by the few who are being loud and polarizing, and we should keep that in mind as well. Some other bluffs in this movement, the institutions like Oxford and Stanford and Georgetown, the prominent institutions who also, most of them are on our list of dinos and runner-up dinos. Most of the institutions, the colleges and universities that are divesting from fossil fuels are not prominent places. They're places like College of the Atlantic, places like Brevard College, places that have small numbers of students, very small endowments. They're not mainstream American higher education. Only 4 of the divesting colleges and universities in the US have endowments that are larger than the national average. All of the others are lower than average. And among the universities that fully divest, there are no nationally ranked prominent institutions. The largest college in the country that has fully divested from fossil fuels is Peralta Community College in California, which has an endowment of $385 million. So we should not be taken in by the projection of the movement as the consensus of an entire generation, as the mainstream opinion of what should be done about fossil fuels or what should be done about global warming. And this report is a first step at that. There are more questions that can be asked. There are more people who can be asking these questions. I encourage you to crack open this report. If you don't have time to read the whole thing, which I completely understand, it is very long, we have the 16-page version, which is much easier to digest, rather. Freudian slip, I guess. And I would encourage you to take a look at these resources. We are available for questions as well. We can open the floor for questions now if there are any questions.